3:17 a.m. The sound was a metallic cough, then a final, dying clatter. It was a noise the city swallowed without notice, lost between the distant wail of a siren and the low hum of the power grid. But in the frozen stillness of the alley, it was a thunderclap. The wind, a razor blade honed on the edge of the lake, sliced down the narrow corridor between brick buildings, carrying with it the smell of cold stone and diesel fumes. It found every seam, every crack, every weak point in cloth and flesh. On the corner of Elm and 4th, a steam grate exhaled a ghost of warmth, a phantom of the city's deep, mechanical lungs. It was not enough. It was never enough. The figure huddled in the recessed doorway of the shuttered bookstore knew the precise temperature without a thermometer. It was a knowledge written in the ache of her joints, in the crystalline crunch of her breath. 3 degrees. The kind of cold that didn't just bite. It seeped into the marrow. Her name was Aara, though no one had used it in years. She was a collection of layers. 2 coats, a threadbare sweater, and a single, heavy-wool blanket, military-issue green. A relic from a life lived long ago. It was her armor, her home, her final defense against the world's indifference. The motorcycle, a small Japanese model ill-suited for a northern winter, now lay silent on its side, a wounded animal. Its rider, a boy no older than 20, was trying to stand. He swayed, his movements clumsy, disconnected. His helmet was still on, his face obscured by the frosted visor, but his gloved hands fumbled at the straps, his fingers too numb to find purchase. He stumbled toward the wall, his breath coming in shallow, panicked bursts. He was losing. The cold was winning. Aara watched from her shelter. She had seen it before. The overconfident, the unprepared, the unlucky. The city was a patient predator. She could have stayed hidden. To be seen was to be vulnerable, to invite trouble, to be moved along. Silence and invisibility were survival. But the boy slumped against the brick, his body starting to shudder in violent, uncontrolled spasms. The first stage of surrender. She rose slowly, her body a map of old pains. Each movement was a negotiation. She unwrapped the blanket from her shoulders. The wind immediately attacked, a physical blow that stole her breath. For a moment she hesitated. The blanket was everything. It was the difference between a night of shivering misery and the fatal sleep that followed. She looked at the boy, then at the blanket in her hands. It held the faint, faded scent of cedar from a chest where it had once been stored, a memory of warmth. She shuffled forward, her worn boots scraping on the frozen pavement. The boy didn't see her approach. His focus had narrowed to the single, desperate task of breathing. She stood before him, a ghost in the dim orange glow of the streetlights. She didn't speak. Words were a luxury, and the cold stole them anyway. She draped the heavy wool over his shaking shoulders, pulling the edges tight around his neck. He flinched at her touch, a sudden, animal fear in his eyes, visible now as he finally wrenched his helmet off. His face was pale, his lips tinged with blue. "Here," she rasped, her voice a dry whisper. "The grate." She pointed to the faint cloud of steam rising 20 feet away. He stared at her, uncomprehending. His mind was slow, syrupy with cold. She took his arm, her grip surprisingly firm, and guided him. He stumbled, his weight heavy against her. He was all leather and frozen muscle, a young man encased in a shell of ice. She led him to the island of meager warmth, pushed him down gently until he was sitting on the cold metal, the rising steam enveloping his legs. She pulled the blanket tighter, tucking it under his chin. He collapsed into himself, the shudders racking his frame. Aara backed away, retreating to the cold shadow of the doorway. She pulled her thin coat tight, wrapping her arms around her chest. The cold was immediate, intimate. It was an old and hated companion. She watched the boy, a stranger who now wore her warmth, and waited for the dawn, which was still 3 hours and a lifetime away. A police cruiser passed at the end of the block, its spotlight sweeping across the buildings, but it did not slow. It did not see, or it did not care. The sun, When it finally appeared, was a weak, indifferent disk in a pale gray sky. It offered light but no heat. The city began to stir, its arteries filling with the slow, cold blood of morning traffic. The boy on the grate was gone. Sometime before sunrise, a taxi had pulled over, its driver roused by a frantic banging on the window. The boy, wrapped in a green wool blanket, had been helped inside, his motorcycle left behind like a monument to his failure. Aara had watched it all from the shadows, an unseen observer. By 8 a.m., the city was fully awake and had no time for her. Officer Miller's shoes made a sharp, authoritative sound on the pavement as he approached her doorway. He was young, his face chapped red by the wind, his expression a practiced mask of weary duty. "Ma'am," he said, not unkindly, "you know you can't stay here. The owners called twice this week." Aara began the slow, methodical process of gathering her few belongings. A plastic bag containing a half-eaten sandwich, a water bottle, a small, smooth stone she'd carried for years. "There was a boy," she said, her voice quiet. "His bike broke down. He was freezing." Miller nodded, his eyes scanning the street, already looking for the next small problem to solve. "I'm sure he was. It's cold. But you need to move along. The shelters are open." He didn't mention that the shelters were also full, a fact they both knew implicitly. It was a script and they were playing their parts. "I gave him my blanket," she added, not sure why. Perhaps she wanted a record of the transaction, a witness to her small sacrifice. "That was good of you," Miller said, his tone unchanged. "Now, please. I don't want to have to come back." He gestured down the street, a silent command. She was a piece to be moved from one square to another on a board she couldn't see. She shouldered her bag and walked away from the doorway, away from the faint memory of warmth from the grate. Her place was gone. As she walked, her gait slow and stiff, she passed a newsstand. The headline on the local paper was stark: "Councilman Thorne vows clean sweep for downtown." Beside the headline was a photo of a man with a sharp suit and an easy, confident smile. His name was Marcus Thorne. The article quoted him extensively, his words polished and sterile. He spoke of revitalization, public safety, and addressing the vagrancy problem to restore civic pride. He described people like her as a blight, a stain on the city's image that needed to be scrubbed away. The article didn't mention the cold, or the lack of beds, or the simple human reality of survival. It spoke only of aesthetics and commerce. Aara was not a person. She was a vagrancy problem. The system hadn't just looked away. It had actively declared her an enemy. The cruelty was no longer passive indifference. It was becoming official policy. She felt a familiar, hollow ache in her chest. It was not from the cold this time. It was the feeling of being erased one official statement at a time. The dismissal was absolute. Her act of kindness the night before had left her colder, more vulnerable, and in the eyes of the city, more of a problem than ever. Aara's world was circumscribed by small rituals. She knew which library branch had the cleanest bathrooms and didn't check bags, which cafe threw out day-old pastries at 4 p.m., and which church steps were sheltered from the north wind. Her life had not always been this way. The details of her past were like worn photographs, faded but still present. There was a memory of a small kitchen, the scent of baking bread, and the warmth of a child's hand in hers. She carried that memory in a small, silver locket tucked deep inside her coat. It wouldn't open anymore, the clasp long since broken, but she could feel the faint outline of the tiny picture within. A smiling girl with her own eyes. Her daughter, Sarah, lost first to a fever, then to the grief that had unraveled the rest of Aara's life, stripping it down thread by thread until only the cold pavement was left. She had been a nurse's aide once. She knew the signs of hypothermia, the subtle shift from shivering to stillness. She knew how to wrap a wound, how to check a pulse, how to speak in a calm, steady voice to someone in pain. These were skills she no longer used, ghosts of a former self. The blanket, the one she had given away, had been her husband's. A soldier. He had left for a war and returned as a folded flag and a box of memories. The blanket was the last tangible piece of that life, of a home and a family and a sense of belonging. Giving it away had been like tearing out the final page of a book she could no longer read but still carried. Miles away, in a sterile white room at County General Hospital, Leo woke to the steady beep of a monitor. His head throbbed, and his limbs felt heavy, disconnected. A nurse was checking his vitals, her expression professional and detached. "You're lucky," she said, noticing his open eyes. "Another hour out there and we wouldn't be having this conversation." Core temperature was down to 89. He remembered fragments. The sickening lurch of the engine seizing. The brutal, overwhelming cold. The feeling of his fingers turning to wood. And then, something else. A shape in the dark. A rough texture against his cheek. A voice like rustling leaves. He sat up, ignoring the wave of dizziness, and saw it. Folded neatly on the chair beside his bed was a heavy, olive green wool blanket. It smelled of cold air and something faintly like cedar. His father arrived an hour later, a man with grease-stained hands and worried eyes. He was a mechanic who had taught Leo everything he knew about engines, but he hadn't been able to teach him about the treachery of a northern winter. "The bike's toast," he said, his voice gruff with relief. "Cracked the block. But the bike can be replaced." "A woman," Leo said, his own voice hoarse. "She found me. She had this blanket." He reached for it, pulling the thick wool into his lap. "She was sleeping in a doorway, Dad. She gave it to me. She put me on a steam grate. I think she saved my life." His father looked at the blanket, his mechanic's eyes assessing its quality. He saw the tight weave, the stitched edges, the faded U.S. stamp in the corner. He recognized the durability, the history woven into its fibers. "We have to find her," Leo insisted. "We have to give it back. We have to do something." The need was urgent, a burning point of clarity in his hazy memory. It was more than a blanket. It was a debt, a profound and unpayable one, rendered by someone who had nothing, and in doing so had given everything. The stakes were no longer about a broken-down motorcycle or a brush with the cold. They were about a fundamental act of human decency that could not be ignored. The city moved on, but the pressure was building. Councilman Thorne's clean sweep initiative gained momentum, fueled by favorable media coverage and support from downtown business associations. The orange notices began to appear, plastered on lampposts, bus shelters, and the brick walls of alleys. They were printed in bold, impersonal type. "Notice of Urban Renewal Action. All personal property must be removed from public spaces within 72 hours. Areas will be cleared by order of the City Council. Property." Aara read the word and looked at her small bag. Her property. The city saw it as trash to be disposed of. The notices created a ripple of quiet panic among the invisible population. Whispers were exchanged at the soup kitchens and in the library's warmth. Where would they go? The woods by the highway were too exposed in this weather. The underpass by the river was already crowded. The 72-hour deadline was a death sentence handed down by a bureaucrat. Sarah Jenkins, a young reporter for the local news channel, was assigned the story. Her editor pitched it as a positive piece on urban improvement. Get some B-roll of the sanitation crews cleaning up, an interview with Thorne, maybe a quote from a happy business owner, he'd said. Keep it clean, upbeat. Sarah met Councilman Thorne in his polished office on the top floor of City Hall. The view was panoramic, showing the city spread out like a map. From this height, the people on the streets were indistinguishable specks. Thorne was charming, articulate, and utterly convinced of his own righteousness. This isn't about punishing anyone, he said, leaning forward in his leather chair, his hands clasped. It's about public health and safety. It's about restoring our downtown for the families, the taxpayers who use it. We have resources, shelters, programs. We are offering a hand up, not a handout. Sarah scribbled in her notepad, the practiced words flowing easily from his mouth. But something felt wrong. She had walked through those downtown streets to get here. She had seen the faces of the people who slept in the doorways. They didn't look like people who had refused a hand up. They looked tired, They looked cold. "Councilman," she asked, deviating from the expected questions, "the shelters have been at capacity for a month. With this sweep, where are these individuals expected to go?" Thorne's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "We are coordinating with faith-based organizations and neighboring counties to manage overflow. This is a comprehensive, compassionate strategy." He used the word compassionate, as if it were a shield. Later that day, seeking a person on the street perspective, Sarah approached a small cluster of people huddled near the bus station. They were reluctant to talk, their eyes wary. But Aara, recognizing the press badge, spoke up. Her voice was soft but clear. "He calls it a compassionate strategy," she said, her gaze fixed on the City Hall building in the distance. "But compassion isn't a press release. It's a blanket on a cold night." The line struck Sarah. It was simple, powerful, and utterly at odds with the polished narrative she'd just been fed. She looked at the woman, saw the deep lines of exhaustion on her face, the quiet dignity in her posture. This wasn't a vagrancy problem, this was a person. The system wasn't just failing. It was actively hostile, wrapping its cruelty in the language of civic improvement. The helpless frustration she felt began to curdle into a cold, determined anger. The story was not about cleaning up the streets. The story was about the woman who spoke of blankets. Leo was discharged from the hospital with a clean bill of health and a lingering obsession. He clutched the green wool blanket like a holy relic. He and his father drove through the downtown streets for 2 days, searching every alley, every doorway. They found nothing. The city's unseen population was skilled at disappearing, especially now, with the orange notices acting as a warning. On the third night, defeated, Leo was at his uncle's house for dinner. His uncle, a man known only as Scrap, was a road captain for the Iron Saints Motorcycle Club. He was large, bearded, and surprisingly soft-spoken. He listened patiently as Leo recounted the story for the 10th time, his frustration mounting. "I can't find her," Leo said, running a hand through his hair. "It's like she vanished, and now the city is kicking all of them out. It's wrong." Scrap looked at the blanket draped over the back of the chair. He walked over, picked it up. His calloused fingers, accustomed to the intricacies of a Harley-Davidson engine, traced the stitched hem. He turned a corner over and saw the faded stencil. U.S. Army. 1968-inch. "This is old military," Scrap said, his voice a low rumble. "Good wool. They don't make them like this anymore." He looked at Leo, a different kind of light in his eyes. "Tell me the story again. Every detail." Leo did. He described the woman's quiet demeanor, her raspy voice, the way she guided him to the grate without a wasted motion. When he finished, Scrap was silent for a long moment. He folded the blanket with a strange reverence and handed it back to Leo. "Stay here," he said, and walked out of the room. The call was made from a landline in the Iron Saints clubhouse, a low-slung building on the industrial edge of town. The man on the other end was Jax, the club's president. He was older than most of the members, a man who had seen more miles than he could count. He listened without interruption as Scrap relayed the story. There was no emotion in his voice, just the flat recitation of facts. The boy, the cold, the blanket, the woman who disappeared, the city's clean sweep. When Scrap was done, the line was silent. Jax was looking at a wall in the clubhouse, a wall covered in photographs of members, past and present, brothers. The club had rules, codes that were unwritten but unbreakable. They policed their own. They took care of their own. They did not seek trouble, but they responded to it. And they honored debts. All debts. "A civilian," Jax said, his voice calm, "with nothing, gave her last shield to protect one of ours, even if he was just a prospect's nephew. She acted with honor." "Yes," Scrap agreed. "And the city," Jax continued, his voice dropping, getting colder, "repays that honor by declaring her trash, by threatening her and others like her. They create a dishonorable situation. That's about the size of it." Another long pause. Then, Jax spoke again, and his voice was no longer calm. It was imbued with a chilling, absolute authority. The debt must be paid. The situation must be corrected. Pass the word. City Hall. Friday morning. 10 o'clock. Full colors. Parade formation. No exceptions. The words triggered a cascade. A code of honor, forged over decades of shared miles and shared risks, had been invoked. This was no longer about one boy and one woman. It was about a principle. An act of grace in the face of oblivion could not be met with an act of sanitized, bureaucratic cruelty. Emotion was now being channeled into a disciplined, organized response. The quiet rage of the powerless was about to be amplified by the roar of 100 engines. The Iron Saints were going to pay a debt, and the entire city was going to witness it. The mobilization began not with a roar, but with a series of quiet clicks. Phone receivers being lifted in garages, workshops, and dimly lit bars across the state. The message was simple, passed from one chapter president to another. Jack's calls. City Hall. Friday. 1,000 hours. Dress uniform, there was no debate, no discussion. It was an order. 1,800 hours. Wednesday. In a town 70 miles north, a man named Chopper hung up the phone, wiped his hands on a rag, and walked over to a calendar. He drew a thick black line through Friday. A lucrative welding job would have to wait. 1930 hours. Wednesday. In a suburban home, a member known as Doc, a paramedic in his civilian life, informed his wife he would be taking a personal day. He went to his closet and took out his cut, the leather vest bearing the Iron Saints colors. He checked the stitching, his movements precise and methodical. 2,200 hours. Wednesday. The calls rippled outward. From the Valley chapter, 22 riders confirmed. From the Coastal chapter, 17. From the Mountain chapter, 31. Men who were mechanics, contractors, bartenders, and truck drivers began to alter their lives around a single point in time. Friday, 10 a.m. Engines were checked. Fuel tanks were filled. Chrome was polished until it gleamed under the bare bulbs of their garages. This was not preparation for a riot. It was for a demonstration. The power was not in violence, but in presence. Overwhelming, disciplined, undeniable presence. Thursday morning, Sarah Jenkins sat at her desk, staring at the bland, corporate-approved script for her story on the clean sweep. It felt like a lie. Her phone buzzed with an unlisted number. She hesitated, then answered. "Is this Sarah Jenkins?" The voice was male, low and gravelly. It sounded like it came through a mouthful of asphalt. "Yes. Who is this?" "A friend. You were asking questions yesterday. The right ones. You want the real story?" "What story?" Sarah asked, her reporter's instinct kicking in. "City Hall. Tomorrow. 10 a.m. Bring your camera. Don't be late." The line went dead. She stared at her phone. The call was unsettling, anonymous, but it resonated with the feeling of wrongness that had been bothering her since she left Thorne's office. She went to her editor. He was skeptical. "A prank call, probably. Stick to the plan, Jenkins. Thorne's office is expecting us at 10:30 for the photo op." "I'm going at 10, she said, her voice firmer than she expected. "With a cameraman. If it's nothing, we lose 30 minutes. If it's something, we get the story nobody else does." He grumbled but agreed, swayed by the logic of a potential scoop. By sunrise on Friday, the air was thick with anticipation. The city awoke to its usual rhythms, unaware that dozens of silent, powerful machines were converging on it from all directions. They came in small groups, merging at predetermined points on the highways. 2 bikes became 5, 5 became 12. They moved with the fluid precision of a cavalry unit, occupying their lanes with an unnerving sense of purpose. They obeyed traffic laws. They did not intimidate other drivers. They simply were, a rolling tide of leather and steel. 9:45 a.m. 112 motorcycles were idling at a traffic light 5 blocks from City Hall. At the head of the formation was Jax, his face impassive, his eyes hidden behind dark glasses. Beside him was Scrap, In a car tucked discreetly behind the first wave of bikes, Leo sat with his father, the green wool blanket folded on his lap. And in the back seat, wrapped in a new, warm coat the club had provided, sat Aara. They had found her in the library, a ghost among the bookshelves. Scrap had approached her quietly, spoken her name for the first time in years. He had explained simply that a debt was owed to her, and it was time for it to be paid. She had been terrified, but there was a gravity in his words, a sincerity that cut through her fear. Now, she sat in the warm car, watching the helmeted heads of the riders in front of her, feeling a sense of surreal, terrifying hope. The quiet endurance of her solitary life was about to collide with the thunderous force of collective action. The press conference was set up on the wide stone steps of City Hall. A podium bearing the city seal stood ready. Councilman Marcus Thorne adjusted his tie, smiling for the small gathering of reporters and city employees. It was a perfect morning for a victory lap. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the cold air made everything look sharp and clean. His clean sweep was scheduled to begin in less than an hour. He was ready to deliver his speech about progress and civic duty. Sarah Jenkins and her cameraman, a lanky man named Dave, were already there. They stood off to the side, away from the officially sanctioned press area. "See? Nothing," her editor had texted. Sarah didn't reply. She felt a low-frequency vibration through the soles of her shoes. At first, she thought it was a subway train passing underneath, but it didn't fade. It grew. It started as a distant rumble, a sound so low it was felt more than heard. Heads turned. A few people looked up at the sky, thinking it was a plane. But the sound wasn't coming from above. It was coming from the street. The rumble grew into a deep, guttural roar, the combined thunder of more than 100 V-twin engines. It echoed off the granite facades of the surrounding buildings, a wave of pure sound that drowned out the city's noise. Then they appeared, turning the corner onto the plaza in perfect, staggered formation. The Iron Saints. They flowed into the open space like a black river, their chrome catching the morning sun in blinding flashes. There were 112 of them. They did not hoot or rev their engines. They moved with a chilling, silent professionalism. One by one, they parked in precise, diagonal rows, filling the plaza, their formation as disciplined as a military honor guard. The sheer, overwhelming presence of them sucked the air from the space. The reporters lowered their cameras, their mouths agape. The city employees froze. Then, as one, every engine was cut. The roar was replaced by a silence so profound it was deafening. The only sounds were the ticking of cooling metal and the flapping of the flags on the municipal poles. The confrontation had begun, not with a shout, but with an absolute, terrifying quiet. Councilman Thorne stood at the podium, his confident smile frozen on his face. His aides whispered frantically beside him. The two police officers assigned to the event stood uncertainly, their hands hovering near their sidearms, but they were hopelessly, comically outnumbered. This was not a situation their training had prepared them for. From the center of the formation, Jax dismounted. He took off his sunglasses, his eyes scanning the scene. He wore his colors, but he looked less like a biker and more like a general surveying a battlefield. He walked forward, his boots making a slow, deliberate sound on the stone. He did not approach the podium. He stopped in the middle of the plaza, positioning himself between the riders and the officials, directly in the sightline of Sarah Jenkins' camera. Dave, her cameraman, was already rolling, the red light a beacon of witness. Jax didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. In the heavy silence, his words carried with absolute clarity. "My name is Jax. We are the Iron Saints Motorcycle Club. We are not here to cause trouble. We are here to pay a debt." He turned his head slightly. Scrap. Scrap moved from the ranks, opening the door of the car. He gently helped Aara out. She was trembling, overwhelmed by the scale of it, by the dozens of eyes suddenly fixed on her. Two of the largest bikers moved to stand on either side of her, not touching her, but creating a human shield. They were her honor guard. 3 nights ago, Jax continued, his voice even and powerful. At 3:17 in the morning, the nephew of one of my brothers was freezing to death on your street. His motorcycle failed. The cold was killing him. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. Thorne started to speak, a blustering sound of official protest, but Jax's gaze flickered toward him, and the councilman fell silent. He was saved, Jax said, his voice dropping, drawing everyone in. He was saved by this woman. Aara, he gestured toward her. She had nothing. She was sleeping in a doorway, with a single blanket to keep her from freezing. She took her only warmth, her only protection, and she gave it to a stranger to save his life. From the car, Leo emerged, holding the folded green blanket. He walked to stand beside Jax. The cameras swiveled to capture him, the young, clean-cut man standing beside the weathered biker president. "This is the blanket," Jax said, taking it from Leo and holding it up for all to see. "An act of honor, an act of grace. The kind of thing your speeches are about, councilman. Community, decency, looking out for one another." His eyes locked on Thorne. "And how does this city, how do you repay that honor? You post notices. You call her property to be cleared. You declare a war on the most vulnerable, not to help them, but to hide them, so they don't spoil your view." The mask of civility on Thorne's face shattered. He was exposed, his platitudes rendered meaningless in the face of the simple, powerful truth embodied by the woman and the blanket. Sarah Jenkins felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. This was the real story. The hypocrisy of the system was being laid bare not by a politician or a pundit, but by a motorcycle club on the steps of City Hall. "She is not a problem," Jax's voice boomed, rising for the first time. "She is a citizen. She is a hero. And she is under our protection now. All of them are." He swept his arm out, indicating the unseen homeless population of the city. The record was no longer the city's sanitized press releases. It was the testimony unfolding live on camera, a revelation of courage against a backdrop of systemic failure. The silence that followed Jax's speech was broken by a single tentative voice. An older man, who had been sheltering near the bus station and had followed the commotion, stepped out from the crowd of onlookers. "He's right," the man said, his voice shaky but clear. "Last winter, she shared her food with me. I had nothing. She gave me half of her sandwich." Another voice joined in, a young woman with a haunted look in her eyes. "She found me a spot out of the wind. She showed me where to get hot water." One by one, others from the city's margins, drawn by the incredible spectacle, began to speak. Their testimonies formed a chorus, a tapestry of small, unreported kindnesses performed by the woman the city was about to discard. They were no longer invisible. The presence of the Iron Saints had given them a platform and the courage to use it. Aara stood, flanked by her protectors, tears streaming down her face. She was being seen. She was being heard. Councilman Thorne's face was a mask of fury and panic. He tried to regain control, stammering into the microphone. "This is an unsanctioned gathering, an intimidation tactic by a known criminal element." But his words were empty. The narrative had been ripped from his control. Sarah Jenkins stepped forward, her microphone extended. "Councilman, you claimed your initiative was compassionate. This woman, Aara, performed a compassionate act, and in return your office served her with an eviction notice. How do you reconcile those two facts?" He stared at her, cornered. The other reporters, sensing the shift, surged forward, their questions flying like arrows. "Will the clean sweep proceed? What provisions have you made for these people? Are you going to respond to these claims?" Thorne turned and fled, pushing through his aides and disappearing back into the safety of City Hall. The public confrontation was over. The truth had been revealed, and the system had blinked. The power had shifted from the paneled office to the stone steps. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Sarah Jenkins' story, broadcast live and then replayed on the evening news, went viral. The image of 100 bikers standing in silent solidarity with a homeless woman was incredibly powerful. The phones at City Hall rang off the hook. The mayor's office, sensing a political disaster, issued a statement within hours, announcing that the Clean Sweep Initiative was suspended pending a full review of our city's policies on homelessness. It was a public and humiliating retreat. Councilman Thorne's political career was effectively over. He became a symbol of heartless bureaucracy, his name a toxic brand. But the Iron Saints did not wait for the city's ponderous review. They had made a promise. That afternoon, Jax convened a meeting with the club's chapter presidents in their clubhouse. The air was thick with cigar smoke and the smell of old leather. "The city will talk," Jax said, his voice low. "They will form committees. They will write reports. In a year, nothing will have changed. That is not our way. A debt is not paid with promises." He laid out a plan. The Iron Saints had what the city's bureaucracy lacked: agility, a network of practical skills, and a pool of private funds. Their benevolent fund, normally used for the families of fallen members, was repurposed. A member who ran a successful construction company, a man named Tank, spoke up. "There's that old warehouse down by the docks. Been empty for 10 years. Solid brick, good roof. We could have it gutted and framed in a month." Another member, a lawyer they called Philly, nodded. "I know the holding company that owns it. I can make them an offer they won't want to refuse. We'll handle the permits, cut through the red tape." The resolution was not a handout. It was a project. They approached Aara that evening. She was staying in a clean, warm motel room, paid for by the club. Jax, Scrap, and Tank sat with her. They didn't patronize her. They spoke to her with a profound respect. "We are acquiring a building," Jax explained. "We're going to turn it into a real shelter. Not a cot in a gymnasium, but a place with dignity. Private rooms, a good kitchen, support services. We have the builders, the money, the lawyers. But we don't know how to run it. We don't know what people really need." He looked at her directly. "But you do. We want you to help us design it. And when it's built, we want you to be its director." Aara was stunned into silence. A job, purpose, a voice. It was more than she had allowed herself to dream of in a decade. The fear and uncertainty that had been her constant companions began to recede, replaced by a fragile, unfamiliar feeling of hope. "Yes," she whispered. "I will." The wrongs were being rectified, not by the system that had created them, but by the outlaws who had exposed its failings. Dignity was being restored, one 2x4, one legal document, one act of determined solidarity at a time. 6 months later, the sanctuary opened its doors. The name had been Aara's idea. The renovated warehouse was unrecognizable. The brick walls had been cleaned, the large industrial windows replaced, flooding the interior with natural light. Inside, there were no long rows of cots. Instead, there were 32 small, private rooms, each with a bed, a small desk, and a door that locked. There was a commercial-grade kitchen that served 3 hot meals a day, a library filled with donated books, and a clinic staffed by volunteer nurses and doctors, organized by Doc, the paramedic saint. Aara was the director. She was no longer a ghost in a doorway. She had an office, a small apartment upstairs, and a staff of 3. She wore simple, clean clothes and carried a set of keys on her belt. The lines of exhaustion on her face had softened, replaced by a look of focused determination. She knew every resident by name, knew their stories, their struggles, their small victories. She ran the sanctuary with the same quiet competence and fierce compassion she had shown on that frozen night. The Iron Saints were a constant presence, but a subtle one. They did not loiter. They delivered supplies, repaired leaky faucets, and provided an unspoken but absolute guarantee of security. Their annual charity ride, once a niche event, was now a major city fundraiser. Local businesses, once wary of the club, now sponsored the event, eager to be associated with their newfound reputation as the city's most effective social action group. The relationship between the outlaws and the establishment had been irrevocably altered. The club had become a strange and vital part of the city's immune system, a check on the indifference of its official institutions. In the entrance hall of the sanctuary, hanging on the main wall, was a large, simple wooden frame. Inside, behind glass, was the olive green U.S. Army blanket. Beneath it, a small, polished brass plaque read, "Warmth in the cold, January 12th. An act of honor is a debt upon us all." It was the facility's founding document, its constitution. Sarah Jenkins won a Regional Journalism Award for her series. The Saints of Elm Street. Her reporting had led to a complete overhaul of the city's social services department and the funding of 2 new municipal shelters, both modeled on the sanctuary's principles of dignity and privacy. One evening, a year after that fateful night, Aara stood at the large window in the sanctuary's common room, holding a warm mug of tea. A fresh snow was falling, blanketing the city in a layer of clean, quiet white. The streets below were hushed. She watched as a young woman, shivering in a thin jacket, huddled under a bus stop awning across the street. She looked lost, scared, and cold. Aara didn't hesitate. She set down her mug, walked to the front door, and opened it. The cold air rushed in, but it no longer felt like an enemy. She stepped out onto the porch and called out, her voice clear and steady, carrying across the silent street. "You don't have to stay out there," she said. "We have a warm room for you. Come inside." The young woman looked up, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. She hesitated for a moment, then took a tentative step, then another, crossing the street toward the light. Aara held the door open, a quiet guardian against the cold, waiting to offer the same simple, profound gift she had once given a stranger. A little bit of warmth and a place to rest. The legacy was not in the building or the headlines, but in the open door, the ongoing cycle of compassion, now sheltered and sustained, a permanent fixture in the heart of the city that had once tried so hard to look away.